Hello, you are listening to Ordinary, the podcast helping Christians live for Christ in everyday life. I'm Katie Holloway.
And I'm Graham Nichols.
And I'm Mark Ventham.
Welcome. How are you both? Did you have a good half term?
Busy, but fun.
Good,
it was okay.
Good busy?
It was that kind of half term, where you end up just doing jobs, visiting and doing all those good things. But it was a good break. It was nice.
Yeah, mine was good. I had a grandson who was unwell, so it took up a bit of my time. But it meant that I saw the other grandson a lot more than I might have done normally. So there's blessings in that. And my grandson's fine, so yeah. But that was busy for different reasons.
Good.
And what about you, Katie?
Mine was
I suppose
lovely.
we should
Thanks for asking.
Graham did. We were just being a bit slow,
Yeah.
Yeah,
because I was thinking about the
It was
next
nice.
question, what the next question might be, but
Yeah,
I suppose
it's
I could be sociable. So did you have an all right half term, Katie?
It was nice, thank you. It was, yeah.
Were you on your own, or was your husband taking time off too?
He had half the week off, which was nice. So there were various sleepovers at grandparents as well. So I actually saw the kids slightly less than I normally do, I actually missed them, which is quite nice. Quite
there
nice.
You go.
It seems unfortunate that your children get to an age where they're quite nice to be around and then school gets them. This is a distant memory for some people.
It's always bittersweet. In a way you kind of want rid of them, and in a way you want them to stay forever.
Exactly
it's a parenting dilemma.
It is.
As a wise man once told me, you just got to enjoy every step.
Did I say that?
Some steps are more enjoyable than others.
Just got to enjoy it.
I think they move. Yeah. They move very quickly. I've every little stage. Just embrace it.
Yeah, that's all we can do. So right, talking of embracing things, this episode we are talking about the cost of living, which we've all got to embrace in one level or another. So let's dive in. Loads of people are talking about, it's all over the media, isn't it? Calling it a crisis, the cost of living crisis. So maybe, Graham, you could talk about this. What do you think calling it a crisis is a helpful term? Or is it something that the media has just coined to scare people, sell papers, all that kind of thing? Or is it a mixture of the both? What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I feel like, and I don't know whether it's just an old man thing, I feel like the media is more frenzied than it's ever been in terms of stories. But I think it
feels
probably
like
isn't.
That to me. I'm not an old man.
It probably isn't. It does seem like that to you as well. Yeah. I don't think it's it's always been sensational. There's always been kind of sensational headlines and everything in my living memory. But I think because it's 24/7 and it's online, there's a particular kind of frenetic thing about the media. And I think cost of living crisis is kind of part of that. Everything has to be a crisis rather than a squeeze or a challenge or something. It has to be, everything has to be melodramatic. So I'm not sure the phrase is helpful, but I think the pure reality is stuff is more expensive by a significant degree than it was. And for some people, that's very challenging. So whether you call it a crisis in the sense of it's not sort of cataclysmic necessarily, and there's not a big tidal wave coming over people or earthquake kind of opening up underneath us, but it is very, very challenging for some people who are on very tight budgets. So it is a thing that's definitely happening. I think you just have to keep it in proportion, but we may talk about that in terms of responses. Yeah,
proportion is probably quite a helpful word. Because there's no denying everything has gone up. I think I was thinking this through, and I think there are probably a number of different kind of categories that people fall into on this subject, and with a number of different responses. So I wonder, Mark, if you could maybe share some thoughts about, as a pastor, what would you say to the Christian who's kind of in the category where they're not on the breadline, so things are more expensive, but they're not in any danger of poverty, but they're really worried about this, possibly because of the headlines and all this. So what do you say to that Christian?
Yeah, I mean, like whenever we're anxious or worried, isn't it? We look to what Scripture says and what the Lord Jesus says, and I think in all these things, Matthew 6 comes to mind in that sense. Isn't it? Do not worry, the Lord, your Father, your heavenly Father knows what you need. So I think that there is that sense of trusting in the sovereignty of the Lord at this time, that we know He's in control. So I keep looking to Him as my refuge and my comfort and my hope. And when I find myself getting anxious and fretful, then I need to look to, turn to the Lord in prayer over that and speak with Him about my fears and my concerns. And, let's face it, some of these fears, they're real. We are worried about whether or not we're going to have, how we're going to afford, food, finance. And it may be that's a genuine and real fear that, things are becoming obvious. And therefore I do need to be prayerful, thoughtful, looking to the Lord, trusting that He will provide. I think also there's a sense of it may also expose my heart. In other words, the person you described, not on the breadline, actually things are getting tighter. It may just expose that actually I have a real love of money, a love of comfort, a love of just stuff. And actually what I'm fearful of is not actually I'm not going to be able to afford to eat, or I'm not going to be able to afford to, but actually just a fear that I'm not going to be able to do the things I really want to do, or a fear that I may not have as much savings as I'd like, or So I think it can expose our hearts, and I think I found that in my own heart, that actually what it reveals is much more a love of something more than a love of God. So I think we want to test that. But at the same time, not to dismiss where there's a genuine, real fear as well for those who are really struggling and facing real difficulty.
Yeah, sure.
We want to hold those things, but I think it is. Like in all these situations, when these things come, they do reveal my hearts, my loves, my desires that are often there before the Lord.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Graham, then, what would you say then to another Christian who's in a different category, where actually they're very well off and they're actually not worried at all about any of the prices going up, and they think the whole thing is kind of, not a big deal at all? What might you say to that Christian?
Give us your money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think in a way it's straightforward, in the sense that we want to encourage sympathy. A bit like Mark was saying about the person who is genuinely worried. There's lots of layers to it, but I think we want people who are well off to be generous in every sense. So to be generous in the sense that they recognise and not so much validate in that necessarily the truth of it is valid, but validate in the sense of seeing other people have genuine worries, feelings, anxieties about this, and to be helpful to them in trying to counsel them, but also generous in that, like a lot of churches, our church would have some kind of means of helping people in crisis situations, some kind of welfare fund situation. Lots of churches would do that. So part of being thankful for the wealth that you have is being generous with it at times like this. That's a real pattern in the New Testament. A lot of the gifts that Paul was transporting backwards and forwards weren't conventional missionary gifts. They were hardship fund gifts, particularly back to the church in Jerusalem. So it was a massive principle of early church life that those who God had blessed with wealth were generous with it. But again, a bit like the person who's struggling, the person who's not struggling, you don't go right in with, yeah, you got loads of money, you need to give it away, or you're worried, you should stop worrying. But to kind of understand and explain, but the outcome of that might be they're generous in their evaluation of other people, and they're generous, hopefully, in the use of their money and so on.
Yeah, I was wondering if a whole new level of judgmentalism might come in now with how people are using their money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is multi-layered. I was talking to someone last week about the fact that a sort of combination of cost of living crisis and climate activism means you kind of feel guilty about putting the heating on. and so there's a whole kind of virtue signal of I haven't put the heating on yet.
Yes.
I'm wearing three layers and my electric blanket. That's all I'm doing, and kind of depriving yourself of some of the good things God has given you. So I don't think the wealthy should, who are not going to be drastically affected by this, should somehow feel guilty that God has blessed them, or that they shouldn't put the heating on just to express some solidarity with other people. But rather they could just see where they should be generous, but also be thankful and enjoy the things that God has given them.
That's really helpful.
It's just striking, isn't it? We talked just actually the complexity of an issue like this that reflects, different stages, different positions, but actually in it all, isn't it? It's working out how we live before the Lord in the position that the Lord has given us. Where is my heart? How am I seeking to glorify Christ in this? And actually, I was just thinking, as Graham said about, the picture in the New Testament of the churches, your hardship funds. It wasn't necessarily wealthy churches that were then giving to the poor. When you think of 2 Corinthians 9:8, that end bit, it's the churches who gave out of their poverty in one sense, giving to the hard. So I think, this is where it kind of, all of these things expose my loves, my hearts. And I can stop. I may not be, super wealthy and therefore not worried. I may be concerned, but actually I'm not on the breadline. And actually I can still be generous, with what the Lord has given me. That But I think our temptation is to suddenly go into self-protective mode. Right, I can't do anything more. I'm going to... And actually I think the Lord keeps calling me to how am I seeking to trust him and walk before him with what he's given me and seek to love others and love him well. And that's in different ways, isn't it? I can be generous in just opening up my home to others. We can be generous in, maybe we do hear someone in need, and actually, you have them around for a meal. There's lots of little ways without it kind of becoming, I need to be able to give X thousands of pounds, but just having that generous spirit through it all, I think is important. I think that's a model to the watching world that we are, we're not. We share their concerns, but we're trusting the Lord, and in that we're looking outwards, we're loving, we're being generous. Yeah.
I think you do have to stand back from your sort of immediate situation to think, broadly speaking, in this country, we are prosperous and so reasonably well off and reasonably secure as well, secure on the streets and so on. So there's loads to be thankful for, whether you're feeling the pinch really hard or whether you're feeling rather complacent about it. There's loads of things to be thankful for. And I think for some people, and I don't really know the stats enough to know, for some people you are at the absolute poverty level of I have to do this kind of heat or eat choice thing. For lots of people, it's other irritating and inconvenient choices rather than life or death kind of choices, or, reasonable health or suboptimal health choices. I was talking to someone again this morning about a friend who was really worried their mortgage is up for renewal. They're really worried they won't be able to afford their mortgage payments when it comes up for renewal. And that's okay. Okay, as in you really want to sympathise and enter into the anxiety of that. They've got a family and all those kind of things and where they're going to live. But in the end, they may have to move out of their house. That might be God's plan for them. They may have to sell their house. They may have to start living in rented and so forth. And that's okay as well. God may teach them all sorts of lessons through that. But that's not to be callous and lead with that, but to kind of if you are in that, you've got to be reasoning. There's still quite a lot to be thankful for in this country, and I could afford a rent, but maybe I've got to have a smaller house.
That's really helpful.
And rent a 1-bedroom house even though I've got 2 kids, or a 2-bedroom house even though I've got 2 kids. When I used to have a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom.
Because to us it doesn't feel okay, does it? But actually recognising that God is sovereign over these things.
There's lots of cultural.
Still.
There's lots of cultural expectations, isn't there? Like. Yeah. We would expect to have a pair of shoes and a pair of Wellington boots at the very least, and some casual and some smart and all the rest of it. So there's loads of expectations we'd have to peel back before we're saying we are absolutely at the heat or eat kind of stage.
Yeah. Okay. What then, Mark? What as a pastor, say a church member comes to you and they are then at that heat or eat stage, like genuinely, how would you counsel them?
Well, I think, the first thing is we want to be of help to them.
Yeah.
So within our church setting, we have a number of avenues that we would explore with someone. So if someone said to us, we're in that situation, we'd want to put in some help. Firstly, we have a hardship fund, a welfare fund, that we would want to see if that could be of help to, bring about any immediate alleviation. We have a team through our advocacy, Christchurch advocacy work, which enables people to kind of assess what help they can get from the state and from other means, and how to save and budget, etc., etc. So there's some practical things we'd want to do, and then we'd want to walk them spiritually in terms of helping them to understand that and what that would look like to trust the Lord through that, and helping them in terms of connect that with the Lord. So in the sense of in kind of situations like that, you kind of read something like Matthew 6 and you go, gosh, well, I eat and I eat and I don't feel it, Lord. But actually helping them to see actually His provision comes in various ways, helping them to see what it looks like to actually trust in the midst of that, whilst also demonstrating real tangible practical love to them as well. So we don't ever want to just help someone practically, materially. We also want to help them spiritually to engage in that as they process, just their heart response to it. And sometimes, you're talking in very different kind of heart categories, aren't you? Because it could be fear on one level, very anxious about, and how you help someone on that level. Could be the other end, that they're very proud and therefore refuse to get help and stubborn. So you're helping them to kind of wrestle through that sense of what will people think, their fear of man. So you're kind of having to understand the individual, where they are and how they're wrestling through with this and what that looks like in the midst of it.
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking about Matthew 6 specifically as I was thinking about this. And Jesus says, don't worry about your material needs, seek first God's kingdom, and all these things will be given to you as well. But does Jesus mean that literally? I was thinking about, that in other parts of the world, there are Christians who are seeking first God's kingdom, but genuinely are dying in poverty. Is it that they're not Christians, or, they're not seeking first God's kingdom enough? Or does Jesus just not mean it literally? How do we apply that?
That's your question, Mark.
Yeah, who would like that one? Free for all.
It's a fair question. It's often asked of this text. I think there's two parts to it. Firstly, I think for us in the West, we disconnect from our situation. Therefore, I'm too quick to think, actually, I've provided for myself. Yeah. So I often don't think or thank the Lord enough for what He has provided, which is why it's a good, even just the little thing of thanking the Lord, at meal times. But it can become habit rather than a genuine sense of saying, hold on, how does this connect through? How am I thanking the Lord? So I think, we have to be really careful, as in the West, where we have been provided much, not to get trapped into thinking the other way. In other parts of the world, it's much harder to kind of, we live in a fallen world. Things aren't as they're meant to be. So that's part of the answer. I don't want to speak. It's hard to. I often hear when I've visited countries that are in that level of poverty, where you see poverty, actually they're often the most generous believers and would testify to this. And they know the experience of the Lord providing for them in ways that we might not connect as providing. So I think it's really easy for us in the West to think, they haven't got any food, and therefore, Matthew 6 is not working out. Often, I think you'll find that speaking to a believer in that situation, they would testify to the Lord's provision in different ways, and in maybe ways that we wouldn't necessarily think of or expect. So I think we have to just be careful of kind of applying what we're seeing to what it is. And of course, I think then you do have a fallen nature. There's a fallen world where there is poverty and there is suffering, and believers do, in the same way, believers die, and believers, persecuted and martyred, because we live in a fallen world. And you wonder, therefore, whether, part of the provision is the Lord calling home, isn't it? In terms of the kingdom first.
Sure.
But we disconnect that, and I think it's our cultural Western views that, and actually, in order to flourish and prosper, that actually you must have X, Y, Z, live in this, and I think the Lord is much bigger than that, and His generosity is often a much more abundant. I was always moved years ago in serving another church. We were partners with a church in Nepal, and they had a building project, and we had kind of sponsored them, and we'd gone out to visit them. And when we'd got there, literally, we're talking poverty. Nepal's one of the poorest countries in the world, and yet here there were these dear believers just kind of going around giving an offering because they'd heard we had a building project and they wanted to partner with us in doing so. So there they were, kind of giving out of their, in order to be part of the church being built, in the UK, and you just, it wasn't ever about financial support between the partnership. It was never about that. But there was a tangible witness of love being expressed between these two churches. We would have looked at it and said, well, that's where, it gets so, it's never as straightforward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. Wonderful to hear of that.
Yeah. And I think, I was going to say, I think there's always an ultimate fulfillment of those kind of words. It's a bit like things in the book of Proverbs, where there are things that are generally true, and then there's things that are ultimately true, aren't there? So when Jesus says, all these things will be added, well, ultimately that's true, that as we seek first His kingdom, all our material worries will eventually evaporate as He provides for us abundantly in the new heavens and the new earth. They're generally true in that we're provided for spiritually completely, but they're also generally true in that I think there's a principle in the way that God works, not a prosperity gospel principle that says this always is the case, but that as we honour God, He honours us. There's a way the world works, which is as we prioritise, He blesses us, not always with masses of riches, but provides for us. I always encourage people to, not in a legalistic sense about the Sabbath day, but I encourage people to take breaks, come to worship services, and say, because I believe it's true, God will honour you for doing that. You won't lose out on business, because you didn't spend that an extra couple of hours working. You won't fail your exam because you didn't spend a couple of extra hours revising, because God will honour you as you honour Him. Not that you don't do any work revising, but you work your schedule around showing up and putting His kingdom first. And you might not revise or work quite as long as someone else, but God will honour that. And I think that's generally true. And I think that's what's been expressed in that verse and a number of others in Proverbs, that God blesses us as we try and honour Him. But it is ultimately true as well.
Yeah, great. On that then, I think it kind of seems like everybody, wherever you go, the cost of living is kind of all they're talking about, or it's certainly talking about a lot. I think it, on your school run, but probably in offices and families and things as well. It strikes me as probably a good opportunity to speak of the gospel and how God provides for us. So what can you, as church leaders, can you think of a good way in for us plebs in your congregation, as we're chatting with those around us? How can we engage with this in a way that does point to Jesus, evangelistically?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think this whole crisis, which is sort of overlaid with the political upheaval and the war going on, and last year COVID and the year before, all these things are really good in unsettling people's sort of complacency, ours as well. And we've talked about that already, us as Christians, but it's good for those who are not believers, where the kind of props that they're using to, in a way, forget about God and provision are taken away. And we're in really basic biblical categories, because the Bible's all about famine and provision and sickness and death and war, and how people trust God in those sort of things. And it's good to be sort of exposed to them. And I would say the best way in is finding questions, first of all, that kind of probe what people are worrying about and kind of why they're worrying, rather than saying, I hear you're worried about food. Well, here, it's the bread of life. Not that anyone's really going to say that in real life. But so rather than leading with immediately, I've got the answer to your problem, is kind of understanding what their worries are. And often giving some sort of personal testimony is really helpful. To say, I've got those worries as well. And it is something I pray about, but I know in my own heart that I'm not always thankful for what I have got, or I trust God to provide. It's something that I pray for every day is for provision. So I think testimony can be helpful. I know it's not the answer, and we need to bring the gospel as well. But as a way in, I think testimony can be helpful, and asking questions.
I think I would just add, that is, asking them what their worries, concerns are. But then the next question is, and how do you deal with that? How are you coping with that? Because that, we understand where they're at, but normally that it then kind of says, and how do you deal with it? And you're kind of then into how you are able to and give testimony. So, I think just the natural conversations of, what is it worrying? How you're dealing with it? What ways are you finding how to cope with it and helpful?
I think the worst thing to say is, yes, it's terrible, isn't it? But that would be our tendency sometimes. We would moan about the government, or we'd moan about something or other, and just leave it at that. And I think it is a discipline, quite a hard discipline at times, to as I said before, not to be false and cheesy, but to think, this is an opportunity to demonstrate the reality of my faith and the poverty of no faith, and get into a conversation. But it's a bit of an effort, when you're walking up. Yeah.
It's hard to disagree with somebody. If somebody says, isn't everything awful? Yeah. It's quite hard to say, no, it's not, because that doesn't make, that's not.
But in one sense,
we're very British.
But one can agree with it though as well, though, can't we? We can say, no, it does feel terrible. Actually, I've found it quite hard. I've been worried about it. How are you finding it? I think that what's interesting is that even just you asking that question has made me think. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not very good at this, and I'm probably just quickly just agree and move on kind of thing, because I don't want to engage, but just because I haven't thought about it as an opportunity to talk with others about it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like when I'm talking with my neighbour, it's just easy just to talk about the stuff, and we talk it, but actually not thinking, actually here's an opportunity to actually think about, this is a way of connecting with the gospel and the gospel hope.
Yeah.
We've got an instant win on the podcast already.
Someone liked us on Footnote?
No, you're learning
something.
You're learning something.
Yeah.
Mark is always learning something.
I was reflecting on, there was a period when our eldest was born where my husband didn't have a job for, I think it was 9 or 10 months. And I was on maternity leave. And actually I had so many conversations with non-Christians about my faith in that year, because they'd say, has he got a job yet? And I'd say, no, but... And somehow our money never ran out. We always had what we needed. And I was able to share actually my faith and say, actually, God has really provided this. So it strikes me that this might well be an opportunity for everyone on a larger scale, as people are concerned about the cost of everything.
Because at the end of the day, it's asking, what is their foundation? What is your foundation for life? What is your hope?
And this does reveal it, doesn't it, as you said?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, next week we're going to be talking a bit more about testimonies and how and why share different testimonies. So perhaps we can pick up some of that then. Brilliant. But for this week, I think we are already about out of time.
We are.
If your clock agrees with mine. Do either of you have any final thoughts you'd like to say before we say goodbye? No,
that sets the bar really high. Like, you got to think of something really wise and profound. But I would only say what I said already. It's really good to be challenged on these things, and I love it when God strips away certain things that you're trusting in, because it then kind of exposes what's there or what's not there. And so however you use it, make sure you use either your anxiety or lack of it for some spiritual good through this mini crisis.
Mini crisis, maybe that's the new term.
But also, if you are struggling, then ask for help.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. You may not even be struggling financially, but you're just struggling with the anxiety of it. Then talk with someone. Come talk with a pastor. Come talk with a trusted friend. Don't suffer in silence.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks everyone. Do get in touch with us. We would love to hear your questions or your thoughts, things you'd like us to talk about. You can get us at ordinary@cchh.org.uk. That's a different thing that I'm thinking of. Do like, share. If you found us helpful, share us with your friends and that. And we'll see you next time.